everyone, my name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have been working with life science companies for the past 14 years. We've been helping them with everything from virtual advisory boards, online medical education, ambassador programs at conferences. We actually mix the best in class of consulting and online recruitment and contracting and all of that extra white glove service that you need and that we bundle on top of our really comprehensive tools on our platform. So we really have a really incredibly differentiating tool for doing collaboration with physicians, payers, allied healthcare providers, and even patients. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations that oftentimes happens in our platform, but even here with some of the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, and the healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm super excited about having one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Dr. Tom Sawyer. He actually graduated and he has an executive MBA from the University of Cambridge, as well as a PhD from the University of Glasgow. Tom Sawyer has nearly 2 decades of experience in everything from entrepreneurship, consulting. He's done private equity investing, corporate finance, as well as strategy in a whole diverse number of sectors, including biotechnology, IT, logistics, and natural resources across the globe. He has held all kinds of positions, including CTO, CFO, CEO, and COO. I don't know what else positions exist in the C-suite. He's actually had them all. He advises and mentors startups and MBA students at the University of Cambridge, and he is currently an honorary lecturer at the University College London School of Pharmacy, as well as currently holding the Chief Financial Officer position of Cognitivity Neurosciences. Dr. Tom Sawyer, so happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be here.
So quite the background. I don't even know where we would start on something like this, Tom, but maybe you can just start off by giving us a brief description on how the heck you ever ended up being in the position that you are with Cognitivity Neurosciences, and tell us a little bit about your career trajectory.
Yeah, look, it certainly is a winding path that's taken me to this point. And I think it's funny how things all fall together at certain points in your career. But yeah, look, I mean, you said it there. I mean, I started off as a young, keen biological scientist, undergraduate degree, ended up being fortunate enough to do a PhD. And I think when I came to the end of that, did some very interesting research, learned an awful lot about, project management, getting, research carried out, working with people and so on. But I realized when I graduated that I wasn't going to have that meteoric rise through the scientific ranks. And so I actually bizarrely ended up working in IT, actually almost by an accident, and started developing and designing technology systems, really database systems and web front ends and so on. So that kept me busy for a few years. And indeed, I started my first company off the back of that, which was really delivering weather forecasting data for specialist use. So things like skiing and climbing, which is what me and my colleagues were very keen on. And that went pretty well. And then I ended up working in consulting a little bit. Just kind of got drawn into, really, I was working in Scotland, got drawn into working in London, really coming to where the action was in the UK. And eventually, kind of worked out that what I was most interested in was really the business side of things. So I was lucky enough to be, accepted to go to Cambridge to do an executive MBA on what was a fantastic course. And then that really kind of changed direction. It kind of, brought those elements that you had before, but brought in a big corporate finance slice. I ended up working in, in finance, evaluating due diligence projects, working, setting up portfolio companies. And eventually I came back around to my first love, which was really in life sciences. So worked in drug discovery, early stage therapeutics companies, and ultimately came to meet the founders of Cognitivity in Cambridge as part of a mentoring situation. And I was immediately struck with, someone who sees hundreds of companies throughout a year, that this was the best idea, or the most, with the most potential that I'd seen for the longest time. So started with a friendship, we ended up working together on raising some money. And, many years later, here we are.
Here you are. So really interesting. And so what I thought we'd maybe start off with a little bit is about what is cognitivity? And more importantly, again, because you were sort of in the fundraising area and you're obviously still in the finance end of things is what differentiated cognitivity from all these other tools that helps you to devise and understand and diagnose sort of these neurological disorders. Tell us a little bit of what you were seeing in the marketplace and what set cognitivity differently and what exactly this company is.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I mean, I think really at the heart of what is special about cognitivity is that the underlying idea is incredibly simple, but incredibly powerful. And this is often the case with really fantastic technology. And really what we do is to look at the way that you evaluate brain performance, i.e. your cognitive function, in a very, very different way. And we often use a sort of an interesting analogy around computing systems. So the traditional way of measuring cognitive function is through a series of memory examinations, effectively over the course of half an hour or so. You'll answer various questions and people will score you in relation to that. And that's like when you're looking to measure the performance of a computer, looking at the hard drive, like how well do you read and write data. We do something entirely different, and it's much more looking at the way the CPU works. So how well can the brain process complicated information? So it's an entirely different approach. We look at a visual stimulus and we measure the speed and accuracy of reaction to those. But the task itself is incredibly simple, but incredibly powerful. And what it does that we do that other people can't do so well is that we're able to pick up on really early changes in performance of the brain. And we can do it in a way that's independent of language. There's no learning effect, and it can be massively scaled. So, from the very first concept, the way that it works is really, really well, but the way that it's developed as effectively as a product or family of products is incredibly powerful and allows us to reach, many, many people very quickly. So yeah, it solves a very clear unmet need in clinical practice, and that is that ability to quickly evaluate brain health.
Interesting. So let's actually just tease apart one of the core areas or fundamental or products, if you will, that connectivity specializes in. And that's just the initial piece around the diagnosis of something starting to happen to you neurologically. Tell us a little bit about that aspect, which is called Cognica. What exactly is that software? How is it set up? What does it do? And what does it help to diagnose?
Yeah, so Cognica is effectively our flagship clinical product. So that has CE marking. We have FDA 510K registration in the US. So it's approved for use in clinical environments. And really it's like you said, it's delivered as software. So the clinical tool is on iPads, and the test itself, you download it, you log into your account, and then it enables you to, in the course of 5 minutes, to really, in a very sort of sensitive and effective way, look at how well the brain functions. Now, we like to use an analogy to equate it to a blood pressure test. So the idea is that a blood pressure test is a very quick, easy to administer test, but it gives you some indication of your cardiovascular health. So that's why it's done routinely. Any checkup you go to, they will always take your blood pressure test. If blood pressure isn't where they expect it to be, the clinician knows then to investigate what's the cause of this. And as a result of that, interventions in cardiovascular disease happen very, very quickly, nice and early. So they have a very good record of effectiveness. Not so for the brain, which is, of course, the most important organ in our body, but it is neglected. It's not looked after in the same way that the cardiovascular system is. So by being able to quickly and accurately assess whether the brain is performing and functioning the way it should be as part of a regular checkup, then clinicians are able to see things coming, to investigate the cause of any impairment, and to make sure that any interventions then happen early enough when they can really have an impact. So it's a bit of a game changer, really. The fact that you can take a technique or a way of looking at brain health that previously needed a specialist and took a lot of time, was very time consuming and very expensive, bringing it to the front line of healthcare where it becomes a much more routine, much more normal thing to do, so that we can just see how well people's brains are getting on.
So I want to kind of double click on that, because there's a lot there and there's a lot of opportunity, and I'm sure you've been thinking about this. So just double checking, you're saying that this is now considered a medical device or a clinical device that actually does something. So now you've had clinical trials, it's actually been evaluated, it actually is a verified clinical tool. Now, yeah. I'm just thinking about the patient or the participant experience. So let's just say, for example, I'm going for a routine checkup to see my physician on an annual basis. So I'm actually sitting there in the waiting room and I'm about to go into the office. tell me a little bit about Connectivity's goal or plan, about what happens or what you would like to see happening before the patient actually gets in the waiting room. Are there things that could be done at home? Is there something that can be done in the waiting room, or should there be something happening actually in the physician office when the patient's actually interacting with the physician? What does it currently look like, and what do you see that looking like in the future?
Yeah, so on the primary healthcare piece, it's like I said, the idea is that you should, particularly when you get over a certain age, let's say upwards of 50, that you should be having your brain health checked regularly in the same way that you would have your cholesterol or your blood pressure test checked. And that's exactly where it sits, in exactly the same place. So if you were to come in for a regular health check, you would either see a nurse or you go into a room, and these are not administered by a doctor, but more by a nurse or assistant within the practice. These are then a sequence of short tests that you do, so blood pressure, cholesterol, you do height and weight, and so on. We sit in with that lot. Okay, so at the same time, you can sit in the quiet corner in the room, do the test, takes 5 minutes. What then happens is that the results from the test go to our cloud-based architecture. It then feeds a report directly through the health record system, the electronic health record system, to the clinician, so that when you go into your consultation with the doctor, at that point, they can have report on your brain health, they can have your blood pressure all in one place, so that when they see you, they already have the information to hand. They don't have to then spend any time in that. And that's one of the sort of very important things that we do, is that we free up clinicians' time so that they can do what they need to be doing, which is talking to you rather than, administering a test on you or anything. So then this high quality time happens. You then also, they get this early warning of any issues that may be there. So if cognitive function does not appear to be where it should be, they can ask why. Is it because the patient hasn't slept? Is it because they're on a course of medication that is associated with lowered cognitive function? Are they alcohol impaired? If you can explain it, then it's fine. You don't need to worry about it. You can keep an eye on it. If the impairment is unexplained, then that gives you a very solid reason to refer. Now, this is a sort of critical point in efficiency on the healthcare systems, because what happens, particularly around things like dementia, currently, is that the primary healthcare practitioner, because they don't have the time to go into any in-depth examinations, they have to use a subjective assessment. So they say, okay, did the patient appear impaired? Fine, let's look into it. Was impairment reported by a relative? Fine, they go into it in that, but that doesn't catch everybody. And also you have the category of patients who are the worried well, who are people that are, they're functional, that they're healthy, but they have maybe forgotten where they parked their car, or they left the milk out of the refrigerator. They start to demand, I don't think I'm cognitively healthy. Can you please refer me? If they refer, they suddenly go into an expensive and time-consuming process. Whereas if they can be easily reassured with a very short test, so it is sensitive and reliable, then again, you're making the system more efficient. So people are referred early when they can be helped, and the referrals are of a higher quality. They are people who need to be seen. So that's really where it sits. So it's a very simple thing. And the test itself is, it plays like a game. It is very much less stressful than sitting in front of a specialist who will sit there with a clipboard and ask you to, recite sequences of letters and numbers, remember words, and so on. You just literally sit there, play this little game. It reports out, but the performance is very, very high. So we're finding that our feedback from clinicians is very, very good.
That's a fantastic process. And I'm actually just sort of thinking, currently that's the way the situation is. But I mean, even with COVID, we have been moving more towards a digital engagement, with healthcare providers of all sorts, including nurses. And this idea about being able to use tools that are digital and leveraging some interoperability so that information is channeled into the electronic health records. How does telemedicine work in this equation, and with Cognica?
Yes, and you touched on a very important point in the previous question, which is the idea that this can be done remotely. So, obviously what we do fits very nicely into the clinical environment. You go in there, you have your health checks and so on, you see your doctor. But our technology does not require to be supervised. So it can be done remotely. And we recently completed a study here in the UK in the NHS about how well it performs remotely, which is very good. So in the whole telemedicine piece, that's really what's trying to be achieved, is the idea that you can have an interaction with healthcare without leaving your home, without having to travel to the clinic, without using expensive facilities. And we sit perfectly with that. So like I said, the idea that you can regularly take a clinical quality test at home, which will then report into electronic health record systems. And in telehealth, you can report other things as well. So we can look at other measures of health that are relevant to helping you to be given into a certain pathway for a diagnosis. So again, it's all about keeping on top of things, having a nice early warning of any problems when you can really address them well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to understand as well too what the business model is. So I'm just assuming that as a participant or a consumer that I could go on to, the iStore or the Android store, wherever it is, and download this onto my phone or my computer. I'm assuming free of charge. I don't know. If that's the case, then who ultimately is paying for this, and what is the business model behind this?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. So currently, with any clinical tool, it is not something that people can just download and use on their own, because the context is very important. So we have artificial intelligence models which work in the background, and they basically give a sort of probability of impairment, so generalized impairment. But again, this sort of measure is not something which is designed for at-home use. Again, clinical supervision is required, because, I mean, if you think about it practically, if you show that there is potentially an issue, well, what do? I mean, if you're sitting at home with nowhere to turn, that's not a very useful situation for anybody. So again, if you take a test, there's potentially a problem. You want to immediately be speaking to a doctor. You want to be finding out what's going on, seeing how important it is, and to be reassured. Okay. So that's the first one. Now, the future of this is actually probably much broader, though. So really, in terms of our business model, we are selling our clinical tool to clinical providers. So that's in the US. We have a lot of business in the Middle East. We've got activity here in the NHS in the UK. And the idea then is that providers will buy a subscription or a license to our product. They can use it as often as they like. And it gives them that extra tool where they can reassure their patients that they are looking after their brain. And also, again, like I said, with the efficiency improvements that are gained through having a reliable measure for making clinical decisions around brain health. That's really, really important. So, and then in which case, the people that are paying for it, here in the UK and places like Canada, there is a much more, sort of a government-driven healthcare system. So then the payer and the provider are basically the same thing. So that works very, very well. But even with our customers in the US, we have many clinicians who are using it that understand that the sort of extra value it brings to them is very important. Again, this reassuring of patients to be able to give the best possible care, to be able to give the best possible outcomes to their patients. So we are finding that it is resonating in the market. Let's put it that way, on both in the Middle East in particular. So we have a lot of success there as well, where they are just wanting to give the best quality healthcare to their patients.
So digital is really making an accelerated impact on an industry that's highly disruptible right now, which is healthcare. And it's coming up in many different persuasive and very useful ways. Now, what's really interesting is you're talking about a core tenet, if you will, of how physicians do an assessment of an individual and diagnose their current health status. And that is using pen and paper. Let's be fair, hopefully that's electronic. But it's going through a series of questions and steps and blood pressure and other things that become a staple in how the evaluation is being done. Now, suddenly you're talking about mental status and mental health. Obviously, we're in a society of an aging society. This is almost becoming a requirement. But my question to you is besides interoperability, is how are you instituting a change in thinking on legacy frameworks, on how physicals or diagnostics assessments are being done, so it becomes part and parcel of the standard way that people think and do, and more importantly, even how things are recorded. We didn't talk also about how this information is conveyed. How do we make sure that there's a little bucket or a little tab on a piece of paper where people are tracking your mental health? What are some of the things that you're doing to make this part of the way we think?
Yeah, like again, a really important area, because anybody that comes to the market with a new way of doing something, there is an element of behavior change that needs to happen. Now, what I would say, our experience is actually that we find that clinicians grasp this very, very quickly. And what we're really doing is taking a process that was previously fairly inaccessible. It was down the diet, you had to refer before anybody got to it. So it was a lot of guesswork involved, and bringing it to the front line. So that just requires a slight shift in the way that people think about whether they can do this, whether this tool does enable them to do that. And we find that doctors, when they realize this, actually warm to this very, very quickly. And it's like, oh, hang on, now suddenly this changes what I can do. And again, it's really helping them to be able to be the best doctor they can. It's giving them information that allows them to make the best clinical decisions. So yes, I think it's always a challenge, but we are not finding it to be one that is insurmountable. We're actually finding, like I say, a great degree of acceptance of this approach, really. And I think that's the main thing. I mean, driving that adoption, that usage, it kind of spreads, right? Once people start realizing that it can be done easily. And again, it's you've mentioned it a minute ago as well, the idea that technology is enabling healthcare to deliver more, and therefore there's an expectation of patients who are customers that more can be done for them. And the idea that people are properly looking after their brain health, that are properly looking after them is become very, very important. And it's become it's almost like it becomes commoditized, this kind of basic level of healthcare that covers everything it becomes closer to a right than a privilege. And that's important that our tools are able to deliver that to people.
I want to talk a little bit about the software and some of that really great algorithm, not obviously getting into any of the IP, but more and less on how it's working and what you sort of foresee in the future. You mentioned that there's some artificial intelligence in that. Obviously, there's the core tenet of machine learning and the idea of building upon an individual's progression of neurological changes over time, and then having that based on what they considered a standard way somebody should be. So there's a predictive nature based on some standards. So I guess the question really comes down to is, number one, is there some concern about some intrinsic bias in the way the algorithms were built based on the history and who people have, how you've collected the data? And secondly, if this is not going to be a standardized tool that patients can just use on their own, how are you leveraging machine learning at a personalized level for an individual to not just take a blood pressure once or again, a neurological assessment once when you're seeing the physician, but being able to do it on an ongoing basis to be able to assess over time progress or changes in the neurological system?
Yeah, again, a really, really good question. So there are two elements to this. And the first one I would say is actually very much related to regulatory requirements. So if you are going to have a medical device that does some sort of diagnostic process, it is important from a regulatory point of view that it works as a one-off. So the idea is that I walk into the clinic, I do this test, it gives a result, that result is relevant and accurate as it can be. Okay, so that's the first one. So that's what we have to do. So the initial Cognica setup is really designed that it has to be able to deliver that. Otherwise, the European Medicines Agency and the FDA and people aren't interested in its ability. It needs to do this reliably. So that's the first one. So it needs to work like that, and which it does. And we have a very comprehensive clinical study which we carried out on multiple sites in the NHS here in UK. And to your point about the diversity of the patient population that we carried it, that's incredibly important. And in fact, by doing a number around London, we actually fortunate enough to be working in one of the more culturally diverse urban populations that we have. So we were able to publish a paper quite recently on the cultural relevance and the transmissibility of what we do. So we're feeling on very comfortable scientific ground from that point of view. But yeah, like you said, it makes a lot of sense when you're able to chart over time. So a one-shot test enables the AI to look at whether the pattern of results it gets from the subject matches the patterns of results we have from our clinical population, which are very well characterized. These have a full expert diagnosis. We have a whole, very, very, very solid endpoints for those ones. So we know what these patients are. So it looks to compare to that. That's fine. It tells you how more or less you look like that or not. So that's true. And that works as a one shot. Now, the trends over time are actually where it becomes very, very interesting, because if you are measuring what your own baseline is and look for deviations or patterns of changes from that, that's when it becomes incredibly powerful. And that's where we honestly believe that the kind of future in terms of the sensitivity and the predictive nature lies is in that how people's patterns change over time. So you see people are stable, then suddenly start getting, more variability in that, downward trends and so on. These are going to be the first signs, okay? And what they require is longitudinal studies to separate those. And we're working on a couple of those at the moment, one notably in Oxford with healthy people who have a genetic susceptibility to disease. So this is, again, looking for the transition from normal into disease state. And again, that's one area. I mean, in terms of the future of AI, I mean, AI has been fairly massively oversold in a number of areas, particularly around health data and so on. But what we are trying to do is really exactly what AI is good at, which is detecting patterns in data. And to your point about, biases built in there, a real important philosophy of our data science team and our chief scientific officer is really the idea that we use explainable AI. The idea is that you should be able to have it audited, have it looked at. People can understand what the elements of the model are that are going in there, because that black box approach to AIs is, as we all know, is very, very dangerous. And then in the future, really what we do is look to expand what those AIs can do to predict. Because at the moment we are a generalized assessment. This is where it has a lot of impact on healthcare. It solves a very particular set of problems in healthcare around brain health. The future is really through taking data sets of well-characterized data sets of patients with a specific condition and looking to make a prediction as to whether that is the cause of the impairment. And that's really where we go to the next level with that. So, and indeed, we filed a patent last year around using it for predicting specific pathology in brain tissue. So these are pathologies associated with Alzheimer's disease, for example. So, so there's loads of, I mean, it's incredibly powerful, and there's an enormous amount of potential. But right now we're sort of nailing the general use clinical product, really establishing that in the market, getting traction and building our customer base, and then from then there are more places we can take this through our installed base to add more help for decision making for doctors. That's really what we are.
Also, probably incredible utility from a clinical research standpoint. So, case in point, COVID-19 happened. I mean, we're obviously out of it now, but it has had dramatic impact on how clinical trials are being done, specifically this idea of hybrid trials or decentralized trials. A lot of trial protocols were modified to ensure that these patient-reported outcomes were enabled. So patients would be able to use tools, or there would be other sort of digital tools in order to capture some of the outcomes of whatever clinical intervention. And I'm just curious around how Cognica and how your company is getting involved with sponsors and manufacturers and using your software as a tool for measuring and outcomes in clinical research.
Yeah, again, a very good question. I mean, our tool is perfectly suited for that. So not only through its sensitivity, but actually through its repeatability, and importantly, this lack of learning effect. And just to illustrate that example, if you think about Alzheimer's disease modifying therapeutic trials, so when they get to the late stages, they have to include a measure of cognitive function. It's one of the main elements of the study that needs to go on. Now, if you are using a test where you can't take it repeatedly because you have a learning effect which increases people's scores over time, you're limited to really taking one of these traditional tests at the beginning and the end of the study. Now, these studies are incredibly expensive. And it seems like an awful lot of risk to have the outcome of that trial in the balance of a fairly imperfect tool that can be taken infrequently. With a tool like ours, you could do it every day if you want to. It has the same level of objectivity every single time it's taken. There's no learning effect. You can't get better at it. There's a very sort of clear ceiling and performance bands for people. So it does absolutely make sense. Now, we have a number of collaborations with academic partners for doing this sort of thing, actually in a number of disease areas. But I think that what you find with drug trials is that they tend to be planned so far in advance in a very sort of conservative way. There is no particular desire to rock the boat. So I think that the positive impact on what we do is a little further down the line. But, it's certainly the case that people like pharmaceutical companies are interested in doing this.
100%. It is a really great way to assess things that nobody was able to assess before. So in terms of, side effects and evaluating some of the impacts. I'm also just curious, you mentioned collaborations with a lot of institutions and collaborations with universities and things. I'm also curious if you have or will consider other potential business collaborations with companies that specialize in neurological disorders, but more using things like ambient biometrics through the use of keyboards or pedometers and all these other things, and maybe creating the super app or the super software. Is that something that's in play or in conversation?
Yeah, so look, our technology works very well in these areas, particularly if you're looking to give users a tool to chart their progress throughout any sort of course, whether it's therapy, whether it's is learning a language, all this sort of thing. So we're so kind of usable and so easy to integrate in all those things. So I think that it's a very important area for us. And one of the things we've really tried to do with our technology infrastructure is to make it very usable. So we've actually built a whole sequence of APIs that enable us to be consumed in other people's systems. So if you have an app system to do digital therapeutics, for example, the idea that you can include a simple to do reliable measure of people's cognitive health as they go through it is a very, very powerful combination. And actually, by giving people that feedback is incredibly positive in terms of people adhering to programs, to keeping going, to seeing the impact of what they're doing. So that is very much part of the way we see this going. And it's early days for us in that area, but it makes absolute sense. And we certainly have a few conversations going on around that sort of approach.
Tom, I'm also curious about the longer term plans of what your company is looking at doing with data. Obviously, through this process, I mean, the question comes down to, is this edge computing? Is this personalized just between a patient and their physician? Or is there going to be an accumulation of data in a database? And if so, what do you foresee as being the plans for this around population health management, the progression of disease? We're talking about like a bolus of people moving into their senior years, and dementia and other neurological disorders coming up. Is there trends geographically, age-wise, population-based? What is going to happen with that? And are you doing that through evaluation of your data?
Yeah, again, a really important point. I mean, as our technology gets utilized over larger and larger populations, indeed, we do gather a wealth of data. Now, obviously, this is anonymized. We don't keep any personal information on our systems. And obviously, the customers that we're doing with this have their own secondary uses for the data over and above just identifying patients. But absolutely, I mean, the population health management piece is incredibly important, and it's becoming more and more as more big players move into the field. Your GEs and IBMs of this world are definitely interested in this. But what I would say about us is that we're an incredibly important tool in that, because there is no other way to get this kind of close to real-time feedback on population brain health, and indeed looking at trends over time. So it's a very, very big deal, and understanding the dynamics of brain health across a population is a very important predictive measure for cost, for impact down the road. Where do you need to invest in? And we all know, brain health is a massively growing issue, just like you said earlier, with having an increasingly aging population, but also more awareness about it as well. The fact that people don't just ignore it. It's not something that just happens and it's passive. You can be very much more proactive and dynamic about it. So again, from an individual level, very important, but on a population level, incredibly powerful.
So Tom, we talked a lot about the diagnosis piece, which is a huge component. And as you mentioned earlier, a huge unmet need, and will be so increasingly over time as we look at our aging population. But I think another important question that people are going to have is, well, maybe I might be having something, or I know I have a family history, or, it's just going to be an age, and I want to do something to prevent myself from degenerating. And I want to maintain my good neurological health. Your company has also developed a really interesting software called Optimind. I was wondering if you can actually talk about that and where some of its clinical utility is.
Yeah, so Optimind is a very interesting thing. We built it as effectively initially as a proof of concept. So the idea is that, okay, if you could take this technology and put it in a much more sort of personal health wrapper. So we take away the clinical component. It's not going to make any sort of diagnosis, but it gives you a tool that enables you to measure, yourself against yourself. So you start to take the test, that the platform works out what your kind of normal range is. You look to see the impact of various elements in your lifestyle or in your cognitive health, because most people would want to optimize their brain health. And, there's some very good research and evidence that says that through modifying lifestyle factors that can positively impact your brain health. So Optimind is set up very much as it's like a health app. So it invites you in, it enables you to connect it to your Apple Watch. You can enter information about your lifestyle, what you're eating, sleeping, all this sort of thing goes in there. And then it's able to sort of work out what are the things that most positively impact your cognitive health in your lifestyle patterns. So it's an enabling tool. It empowers people to to understand and to take control of what they do in their life for their brain health. And it turns out to be really quite fun and a fairly kind of, sticky tool. So, the potential for that going forwards is very, very important. Again, we're not, if you use the platform, the data is yours. We don't share this with anyone. That's not sent to any doctors. It's not anywhere. It's for you to, to monitor yourself. But of course, if you start seeing any changes in your pattern, then it would be entirely natural for you then to perhaps go and speak to your doctor and have the clinical tool, have that used and put it in the context of other things. So it's very interesting. I mean, I think that is ultimately where a lot of the future of this kind of technology goes, that you put it in people's hands. You bring it closer to them from it being an exclusively medical experience. But yeah, no, it's a great thing. And indeed, we've got a trial going on with a very big Japanese insurance group on trying out whether it works with their consumers as just something that they have, by giving people a tool that enables them to look after their own brain health, they start to do so, right? And then in which case you're actually de-risking an awful lot of very expensive, complicated, hard to diagnose things that happen that can be very much offset or delayed by good lifestyle practice.
Beautiful. Lots and lots of exciting things, Tom, with what Cognitivity is doing, with all of your software, with Cognica and Optimind, and probably other things in the future. So very exciting. For anybody who is interested in this discussion and would like to connect with Tom, either collaborations, partnerships, learning more, please look for his contact details in the show notes below. We also encourage, if you enjoyed this conversation, please check out impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of discussions we have with physicians, payers, allied healthcare providers, and payers, working with sponsoring pharma or medical device companies on planning and doing different things with their brands around education and market access, education, etc. We do this through a series of synchronous and asynchronous touch points over time, all digitally and managed with our white glove service. So please check out impetusdigital.com. We'd also thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe. And we'd also really appreciate if you can leave some feedback on iTunes. Thank you all for your time. Tom, this was an absolutely enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much.